Hello, and welcome again to Asian World Podcast with Dr. Hawkins. Today we have kind of a fun issue. It takes place during Dynastic China, but I think you'll find it a little bit more proximate and relevant than you might expect. By the 12th century, China's Song Dynasty had undergone a dramatic economic revolution, spawned by an organized migration to the south. The first emperor of the Song Dynasty, Jiao Guangyin, or the Taizu Emperor, organized a migration to the southern part of the country in the hopes that he would open up more cultivated land and sort of alleviate some of the pressures on the poor. Well, the great thing about moving south in China is the further south you get, the warmer it gets, until eventually you can double crop, and as you approach Southeast Asia, you can triple crop. This leads to an explosion in food production, and the increased amount of food product eventually leads to a number of proto-capitalist developments in the Song Dynasty by the 12th century. So, for example, they developed things like market specialization, niche products. There was a robust service sector with shipping and brokering, and eventually you got the rise of lending institutions. And at one point, they even have paper currency. But above all these proto-capitalist developments, there is one that is really preeminent, and it's really the ultimate sign of a kind of proto-capitalist developing society. And that's something we call competitive consumption. Now, what I mean by competitive consumption is a transition in which one's status or value in society moves away from more historical markers towards what one buys, owns, and consumes. Before this time, what really measured one's value in society was your family name, service performed for the dynasty, gallant acts of war, in some cases your religion, things that kind of were passed down from generation to generation within the family. But once we get the development of competitive consumption, a family and an individual's value is really determined more by the symbols of material wealth and consumption than those other more historic values. We are, of course, familiar with this, particularly in the United States. One's value and one's family's value since the Industrial Revolution is definitely inscribed in what we consume and what we buy. And so our value as individuals and as families is inscribed on cars, clothes, houses, watches, and 1,000 other little things that exhibit our inherent value to the community. Now, even though we think this is shallow, it's not really just that we want to exhibit what we have to the community in terms of look at all the great stuff that I own. It's that we've all decided to engage in this collective judgment of inherent value based on what we own and what we consume. And so we all make judgments about level of education, work ethic, intelligence, discipline, refinement, tastes, breeding, and inherent contributions to society based on what you're able to buy. We all like to think we don't play this game, but you definitely do. And I don't care what class you find yourself in. This is the game that we play to display our value to others. It's why when you go into a job interview, you put on your best clothes, you put on your best watch, you're groomed in a particular way. And it's not because they're going to look at the suit or they're going to look at the dress or they're going to look at the watch and they're going to say, oh, he owns nice things. But the fact that you have them indicates a certain level of intelligence and credibility relative to your contribution to the marketplace. Here's the interesting thing about this. We as historians tend to find this phenomenon across space, time, and culture. And that's pretty cool. So one of the things we've seen the rise of over the past 50 years or so is what's called cultural relativism. And in a lot of ways, it's been great. It's a wonderful thing because it's allowed us to acknowledge and appreciate other cultures, to learn from these cultures, and to be more accepting and more cosmopolitan, especially as the world globalizes. The one downside to cultural relativism is that it can also tend to silo us, right? Where we say, well, if our experiences are so tied to culture, society, place, and time, then, for example, I could never really understand the life or experiences of an Irish immigrant unless I was an Irish immigrant. And I can appreciate it, and I can look at it, and I can learn from it, but I'm never really going to understand it. And I think to a certain extent that's true, but the problem with that is that it tends to separate us as groups of human beings in a way that can't be mutually understood. And so we as historians get super excited when we find a phenomenon that seems to take place regardless of space, time, culture, or society. And competitive consumption seems to be one of these things. Well, in dynastic China, this takes hold in the 10th century during the Song Dynasty, as we're seeing these economic developments. And one thing we find very specific to all cultures again, because women are the primary site of inscribed wealth, as competitive consumption increases, we also see the fetishization and alteration of women's bodies to accommodate. And this seems to be true again across space and time. In Song China, this took the form of a particular practice that emerged in the 10th century. It began among court dancers. So the upper classes would go and they would watch Chinese opera and Chinese acrobats, and they just kind of loved this popular culture. Well, for whatever reason, the upper classes began to fixate on the tiny, petite, sort of very feminine feet of the Chinese acrobats and dancers. As this aesthetic taste for small feet grew among the upper classes, naturally, upper class women wanted to imitate the trend by binding their own feet. This sets off a particular race of competitive consumption. Because here's the thing about competitive consumption. If I do something that's in fashion, and then suddenly everybody does that thing that's in fashion, then nobody's doing that thing in fashion. Nothing makes me exceptional. There's no way to inscribe my elitism in what I'm consuming or the alteration of my body. Therefore, if everybody begins to make their feet look smaller, I have to make mine look smaller yet. And so as women strive for smaller and smaller feet, after a couple generations, the ideal ultimately becomes 3-inch golden lilies. As you can imagine, feet don't naturally occur in 3 inches. And so you have to begin to alter bodies, as women have done throughout history. By the end of the Song Dynasty, as many as half of all Chinese women bind their feet, and certainly 100% of the upper classes. Bound feet soon becomes the standard by which wealth, intelligence, breeding and refinement, and especially value of not only women, but their families are judged. By the end of the Song Dynasty, no proper woman could be married without bound feet. As you can imagine, it's quite a process to get 3-inch golden lilies. As the generations progress, ideally you start when the girl is kind of in a sweet spot between 4 and 7 years old. Now, the reason you want to start there is because the bones are somewhat developed, but still pliable. Binding feet is a 2-stage process. First, the toes are bent under. So you would take the toes and you'd bend them under the sole of the foot, bend until they break. Now, once they're broken, you bind the foot tight and let the bones knit back just a little bit, and then you break them again and wrap, and break them again and wrap, and break them again and wrap, until you have a kind of cone-shaped foot in which the metatarsals have curled and the toes are now located under the sole of the foot. Now, once this process is done, then the metatarsals have to be broken again upwards and buckled. And so you would break the foot downward and have the metatarsals buckle up and bind it, then break them again and bind it, and break them again and bind it, until eventually you have a small, petite, anvil-shaped, and according to the taste at the time, beautiful foot. Now, as you think about that process, in which these young girls are oftentimes placing their foot on a wooden block and having the bones broken downward, and then having it knit together, and over the course of their lives, continuing to keep them bound in this small way, you're probably thinking, well, aren't there physiological problems that would result? And you're right, there are. Now, there's too many to talk about, but let me talk about just a couple that are probably occurring to you. The first and most obvious, if you look at pictures from the time, is that because the toes are broken underneath the sole of the foot continues to kind of curve in on itself, right? So you're walking around for a good part of your life on those bent metatarsals. But as you get older, they curl under until you see pictures of old women in China that are just walking around on their ankle bones, and their feet are kind of curled up underneath. The other problem occurs throughout the life of the bound foot, but particularly at the beginning, and that's, of course, your toenails continue to grow. Now, before the foot is bound, as it's unbound and broken, and they're about to bind it again, the toenails are trimmed all the way back to the cuticle if they can. In some cases, they pull them out. Or in some extreme cases, there's records of them actually amputating toes so they don't even have to worry about it. But the problem is, once the foot is bound, those toenails continue to grow. And as toenails grow, they simply pick the path of least resistance. And so oftentimes toenails would curl around and grow into the flesh and up through the bottom of the foot, come out the top of the foot. And so managing toenails became a huge problem, especially in the formative phase, but definitely throughout the period of a bound foot. Of course, that leads to the third one, which is the constant threat of infection. Infection came in multiple forms. First, obviously, is when you wrap the foot up, as the bones are knitting back together, you can't release the foot. And so any bacteria that's caught underneath those bandages will naturally start to fester and rot and eat the flesh. As it does, the bindings become soaked through with pus and all kinds of infection until a lot of times they would ossify into these like cast-like wrappings. And so to get them undone, the little girl would have to soak her feet in hot water and a number of caustic chemicals, and then they would have to peel them off. But the problem is you're peeling off this hard cast. It's stuck to the flesh of the foot. And so by peeling it off, you peel off layers of flesh. And so the foot always remains a little bit raw. And so you have to constantly manage infections on the flesh. Now, again, this is particularly intense during the formative period. But again, throughout your life, as you keep your feet bound, you're constantly beating back infection. And finally, just the intense, crippling, lifelong pain. To walk on bound feet is not easy. To manage children, to manage households, to just manage day-to-day tasks becomes an extreme challenge. However, because it becomes the standard of inscribed wealth, ultimately, mothers are faced with an agonizing dilemma for their daughters. If a woman cannot be married without bound feet, a mother faces a decision when her daughter reaches the age of 3 or 4. Because bound feet become the ultimate standard by which a woman is judged, and the family that she comes from, when a girl reaches the age of 4 to 7, her mother faces an agonizing decision. On the one hand, you need to bind your daughter's feet. Because China comes from generations of an extreme patriarchal system, when you have a little girl, you're really raising her for someone else. She's not really a relative. She'll get her proper familial name when she is married and in her husband's family. And so in a lot of cases, you don't even bother giving her a name. Yung Chang's book, she talks about her grandmother was not even given a name. She was just called little girl number 2. And so your real goal is to raise her up and make her marriable so that she can go to another family, she can receive a proper name, and then she can bear the next generation of that family. And so as a mother, I'm faced with this agonizing dilemma. As I'm breaking her feet, as I'm binding her feet, as I'm forming these little 3-inch golden lilies, on the one hand, I either have to harden my heart and stop my ears to her cries and her pleas to take the bandaging off, or I can have empathy. I can gather her in. I can take away the pain. I cannot let this happen. And by doing so, damn her to a life of agony and poverty. And 9 times out of 10, the decision is clear. Bind the little girl's feet. This is what will make her acceptable to the matchmaker and to a prospective husband. So the way the ritual worked is 2 families would come together. They come to a matchmaker, and the matchmaker would look at the family status and prospects, and then they would bring 2 people together, and the families would arrange a marriage. And as the marriage was arranged, the young prospective bride would be dressed up, and she would be brought on a litter by servants and presented before her prospective mother-in-law. And as part of the ritual, the mother-in-law would lift the skirt, and she would inspect the little girl's feet. And of course, if she saw nice, petite, well-kept, well-formed bound feet, the assumption is obvious, right? Inscribed wealth. She obviously comes from a good family, a family with discernment, and a family with taste, and a family of substance. On the other hand, if they bring the prospective bride and the mother-in-law lifts the skirt and looks down and sees these 2 gigantic feet looking back at her, what's she going to assume? Oh, this is an ill-bred, backward, impoverished family. And it would be the equivalent of us today saying, look, these people are hillbillies. They have no value. They contribute nothing to society. They're unable to inscribe their wealth on their daughter's feet. Therefore, they don't have any inherent value to society. These are valueless people. And so the mother-in-law is the one that ultimately makes the decision. Now, as odd as this sounds, as foreign as this might seem, it's really not. It's incredibly proximate. Like all fashionable body alterations, from corsets to high heels to breast enhancement to lip filler, bound feet essentially inscribe a woman's beauty and value, but they also make her less mobile and less productive. In other words, it's a statement of wealth. If I make a body alteration that is unnatural, what I'm telling society is I am so rich, I can afford to become less efficient. I am so rich that I can afford to cripple myself. That is the ultimate statement of wealth. But when we think about it in terms of class, as painful as it was, the upper classes could afford to get away with it. If you're an upper class woman that actually comes from wealth, you have servants to carry children, to harvest crops, to clean, to cook, to carry water. But the poorer classes, as they begin to imitate the practice, the agony of fashion, the agony of inscribed wealth falls most heavily upon them. So if I'm a woman from a poorer class family, and I don't have servants to carry my kids on their hips, and I don't have servants to carry my firewood, and I don't have servants to harvest my crops, it means that I have to conform to these standards of value, but I still have to perform all the agonizing labor associated with my class. And so as always in all societies, the agony and the burden of inscribed wealth in the form of fashion and body alteration always falls most heavily on the poorer classes. But what's even more interesting is as we add layers to this, is that whenever wealth is inscribed on a woman's body, that a family's inherent value is seen in her adherence to trends, to fashion, to body alteration, the parts of the body that are enhanced or altered necessarily become sexually fetishized and serve as erotic standards of beauty for both men and women. So even in our culture, if you think about what is beautiful, from dresses to high heels to undergarments that produce a particular form, it's all about enhancing beauty and sexuality. So this becomes the standard of desire for men. But if we take a step back, it's worth asking the question, why would men find this beautiful? And we can self-reflectively ask the same question about any body alteration in our culture or any standard of beauty. Why do we think this is beautiful? Well, in terms of bound feet, even though it may seem strange, there are a number of common themes that we see in bound feet that really adhere to sort of comprehensive male understandings of beauty. Let me give you just a few. Number one, across space, time, and culture, men across the world and across time find something so attractive about a vulnerable woman in distress. Look at any classic fairy tale, look at any story of heroism, and there is something desperately attractive to men about finding a woman vulnerable, in distress, and rescuing her. Now, it's not too hard to figure out why. I mean, this does a number of things for a man. Number one, she needs you. You're needed. She relies upon you. She's helpless without you. What's more, you're a hero to her. You'll always be the one that rescued her. She'll always feel a bit indebted to you. Now, by our standards in the 21st century, this comes off as incredibly chauvinist, but it is something that we see across space and time. To rescue a desperate, vulnerable woman is deeply attractive to men. And so, of course, a woman for the duration of her life that walks around on bound feet, that has trouble getting from here to there, she'll need my assistance, right? I can pick her up and carry her through the door. I can carry something for her. I'm needed. I'm wanted. And I can always sort of continually be her hero. Second, and this is much more practical, she's restrained, right? I mean, in a patriarchal system, the worst thing that could possibly happen, the worst fear of all men, is that they give 1,000 generations of wealth and inheritance and a family name to another man's child. That is the worst possible thing that can happen. The patriarchal chain will have been broken. And all of the efforts and sacrifices of my ancestors, 1,000 generations with their eyes upon me, will watch me give the family wealth, both material and otherwise, to another man's child. And so in such a system, it becomes desperately important for the men to restrain and control and surveil women's sexuality. Well, bound feet enable this. Right? I mean, she can be controlled. She can be kept at home. She's not going to run away. Right? I'll catch her. She can't go out dancing with her friends. She can't go out and work in the fields beyond a certain radius of where she lives. And so bound feet, in a very real way, are a method to control, surveil, and restrain women's sexuality. And thus, too, in the minds of the men, to protect the inherited value of the family through the patriarchal line. Next, and this is we see in the high art, right, in the high culture of the period, bound feet enhance femininity. There's been 1,000 poems, probably 10,000 poems, written about the demure, feminine, petite, cute little steps that a woman with bound feet takes. She walks so gingerly. so carefully, so thoughtfully. The poems describe the way that bound feet make a woman's hips sway from side to side. As she walks, because she's walking on her metatarsal, there's a slight bowing of the legs, which men, again, in poetry find incredibly erotic. And so the whole idea of a woman walking so carefully and so gingerly is thought to be the epitome, the quintessence of femininity. And so bound feet, for men and for women, enhances this notion of their femininity. It makes a woman feel more feminine. It makes a man feel like his spouse or his prospective bride is an incredibly womanly woman. And finally, and this is also the case with any time that a woman's body is altered, particularly within the context of competitive consumption, is that it becomes the primary site of sexual interaction. And so in China, there is a huge culture of feet being the primary erogenous zone for men and women. Because of the heightened sensitivity due to the extreme damage to the foot, their feet become a site where every touch and every tickle and every pinch becomes greatly enhanced. And so this becomes a primary site. There's all kinds of implements that were developed over the generations where a woman's foot could be tickled. There were little clappers. You could clap on the bottom of her feet. As a matter of fact, there is a great Zhang Yimou film called Raise the Red Lantern. And it's about this rich man, this landowner, and he has a number of concubines. And he would raise the red lantern, the servants would raise the red lantern in front of the residence of the woman that he was going to spend the night with. And one of the greatest actresses of all time, Li Gong, is one of these mistresses. And there's a scene where they come in and they kind of clap her feet with it. But again, this could seem odd to some of you, but think about the way that we fetishize and alter parts of women's bodies. And there's certainly featured sites of sexuality in everything from shampoo commercials to more unmentionable sites, right? And so it's really not that different. Finally, it might be worth engaging in a little bit of gender analysis as we look at this phenomenon. On the one hand, when we look at bound feet, when we look at the commodification of women's bodies, when we look at the alteration, and when we look at the bound sexuality, slam dunk, right? I mean, it's a slam dunk case of patriarchal oppression. It's obviously the oppression of women, catering to men's sexual tastes, catering to a patriarchal system of inherited wealth, the commodification and fetishization of their bodies, and inscribing a family's value on the sexualization and aesthetics of a woman's body. Seems like a classical case. On the other hand, we need to consider the enforcement mechanisms of the practice. I mean, on the one hand, who is inflicting this on the little girls? It's their mothers. And it's the mothers-in-law that are judging and approving the prospective brides based on their body alterations as worthy or unworthy for their sons. And so the vast history of footbinding in China is a case of feminine on feminine violence. Now, of course, we can view this as women acting within a particular system that has conditioned and incentivized this violence. And that's fine. That's probably true. But we always want to be careful of any theory or explanation that denies historical actors of their agency, and in turn turns them into passive receptacles of history or inauthentic historical subjects acting under a false consciousness. And what I mean by that is if we say, okay, well, this is obviously woman-on-woman violence, but it's being precipitated by a systemic compulsion, I think that's an adequate explanation. But the problem is, what are we to say about all these women? That they just live their lives under a false consciousness? And we could ask similar questions. I had a student and she was thinking about this and she was relating a story of when she was at a particular store and she was watching mothers buy prom dresses for their daughters. And she describes to me how the purchase of the dress, the style, the cut, how it looks was all dictated by the mother. And so the mother said, oh, this will make this particular part of your body look great, or this will really look good, or this color matches your skin. And so it was really a case of, even in our modern progressive 21st century society, mothers looking to inscribe their value, their family's value and their family's wealth on the bodies of their daughter going into a prom where other daughters of other families were similarly going to dress. And again, maybe 21st century mothers are also under a false consciousness. I don't know. I mean, I obviously am coming at this perspective from a man, so I can't speak to it. But I'm always uncomfortable when I come up with an explanation that essentially falls back on the notion of, well, they're acting under a false consciousness. So I'm not sure what to do with that. And of course, my students have also pointed out that this occurs from peer to peer as well. So sometimes when I teach this in an honors course, all of the students know each other really well. And so they're comfortable kind of getting into these arguments. And the class always seems to divide in two, right? So on the one hand, we have a certain number that say, yeah, this is absolutely, the system is patriarchal oppression. The whole fetishization of women's bodies and commodification of women's bodies is designed specifically to cater to men's tastes. And then we'll get the other half of the class that'll say, no, I don't think that's true. And they give personal anecdotes, but it's been pretty categorical across my time as a professor where they say, no, whenever I go to buy a dress, whenever I go to buy shoes, whenever I go to buy anything, I'm not thinking about my boyfriend. He could care less. He won't even notice. Whenever I buy something, I'm thinking about what my peers, my female peers, will think about it and how they might judge that purchase, or what they might think of my body as it's arrayed in this particular garment. And so they will argue to the end that all of this is equally enforced by women, not only mothers, but then once you move on from your mother, by peers, and what other women think of the way that you enhance your body or the way that you conform to standards of fashion, and more particularly, the ways that you inscribe your value on your body. And so when we look back over the scope of time, dynastic China seems so remote and so far away. And when we talk about footbinding, my students always a little bit cringe at the beginning. They say, oh, this seems odd. But once we bring it into the realm of how our culture works, in particular in the 21st century, it's not so far away. Not so far away at all. Thank you for listening to this episode of Asian World Podcast. Please like and subscribe and check out my published works. If you'd like to contribute to this podcast, please see the description below for a link. As always, thank you.